Good evening. I'm Julia Hastie from Rosalind Road Therapy Centre, and tonight we're going to have our final discussion looking at the body and mind connection, or as I like to put it, the body and mind brain connection. And we're specifically speaking tonight about the subject of HIV and AIDS. Now, I think the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s was our first real experience on a global scale of a disease that swept through the whole world. Rich, poor, African, European, Australian were all affected by the AIDS epidemic. And I think if we look back, we can relate to many of the aspects. As information started spreading around the world about HIV and AIDS, there was just an explosion of information that was shared with the public. Some of it was very valuable, some of it was not as valuable. And partly that's because it's an ever-evolving new disease that was discovered. And as research was becoming available and being shared, it was being shared around the world from the science into Joe Public, and Joe Public having to understand a completely new disease. And unfortunately, it's human nature in that situation for there to be a fair amount of misinformation. If you look at the situation we find ourselves in the COVID pandemic, we have had a very similar experience where a new illness bursts onto the scene, so much information is shared, and just when you think you've come to understand it and decided how you're going to live around it, new information comes out, or a wave ends, or a lockdown starts. The information goes on and it's ever changing. That can be very frightening and leaving a person feeling a little bit helpless. Now, certainly with the HIV and AIDS epidemic 20 years ago, unfortunately, the way it was handled and the way the information was shared became extremely controversial, and a highly politicized treatment of patients and care was followed. And when an event becomes political and used for different agendas around the world that don't necessarily have the patient at heart, it's often the patient who loses out. Now, when we speak specifically about HIV and AIDS, I think a huge amount of work has been done in the last 20 to 30 years to change the understanding of the public, specifically around the stigma. There were a lot of judgments and untrue things said about HIV and AIDS in the past, and those stigmas are something which are unkind and create a lot of division amongst people and does very little to address their care. And the underlying factor in this problem of misinformation and controversy and stigma is that there is a huge degree of fear that begins to spread. It spreads certainly amongst the patients and also to their families and their communities. And what starts happening is a division of those who do and those who don't, those who understand, those who care for, those who are involved in, and those who are not. And that's a great tragedy for humankind. And let's make it personal for the patient. What does it feel to be in the middle of this pandemic of information? What does it mean to be the patient with a disease that comes with stigma and mean-spiritedness and unkindness from a community, with judgments and false informations? I think certainly it must be extremely frightening and will begin to impact on a person and how they see themselves. And that is certainly something we want to really address as caregivers of patients with HIV and AIDS. Also, for the caregivers, would have to potentially face pushback from communities and judgment. The caregivers would need to look at their own ideas and if they have opinions and judgments about HIV/AIDS, and if their community is judging them. We want to clear all of that away. There is so much more to humankind in what we share and what unites us than whatever separates us. And when we start going into a space of separating people because of their healthcare status, particularly HIV and AIDS, we're going into very dangerous territory. We have enough understanding now to know that a patient with HIV and AIDS will need treatment for their whole life, but certainly can live a long and healthy life, and no stigma and separation is necessary. So let's have a look. What does it feel like to be in the middle of an event that has all these ideas and associations and mean-spiritedness as well? Well, if one is feeling frightened, if one is feeling alone, what am I doing in the middle of this situation? There's a possibility of a person blaming themselves if their behavior contributed to them contracting the disease, and feeling judgment of themselves or judgment of the system by which they contracted it. Now, judgment and self-blame and fear are, use a huge amount of energy in the body. It consumes a lot of emotion. It consumes a lot of mental energy. And when a person's body and their immune system needs to be working on dealing with a virus every day, all day, every day, and the immune system needs to be very strong. What we don't want is the immune system getting worn down and worn down and worn down by fear and worry about information and perhaps even false information out there. Now, there are two ways of addressing this situation of being in the middle of a world event. And I think they're both valid. And I think it really boils down to the personality of the patient and the caregiver. For some people, becoming an activist and taking on the world and sharing and educating and exposing and exploring and being an activist for change is an extremely powerful, energizing experience. To go out there and give talks and share personal journeys and talk to the neighbors and talk to the community and talk to the church and educate and educate and educate is a great gift to humankind. For extroverted people, for people who have a clear understanding of their illness, I think it is a great outlet to, instead of feeling that one is a victim of a disease, that one is in fact a master. And what a contribution to the community to be able to educate and act and be an activist for change and care. Certainly in South Africa, there's been this powerful grassroots movement towards re-looking at the treatment of HIV and AIDS patients and how from the government to the community work with them. Very, very powerful. However, that uses a lot of energy. And some people are not energized by being out there and sharing and discussing and talking. The alternative for that is for the person who wants to deal with their own personal experience and only that experience is, I believe, to step away. Not step away from the diagnosis and the treatment, but step away from the story and the drama. I think it is valuable for a person who doesn't want to get involved in the whole discussion and the debate, maybe a more introverted person or a person who's more shy or a self-conscious person. You're entitled to make the decision to say, I don't want to get involved in this conversation. I don't want to talk about it at all. If that's the kind of way of dealing with something that works for you, the law at the very basics gives us that permission. The law tells us that one is not required to reveal one's status at all. And so it's not about being secretive. It's about making a decision for oneself to say that I'm not going to be having the HIV/AIDS conversation here, there, and everywhere, wherever I go. I'm not going to have that be the defining moment of my health. And that includes limiting the amount of time one spends on social media. Social media is alive with information. Dr. Google is alive with even more. And it's a very natural habit to get into researching and Googling and seeing if there's new and see what people are saying and watching, ironically, YouTubes. There comes a point where there is enough information. If you're the person who's decided to stop and step away from the ongoing story of HIV/AIDS, that will require having a degree of mental discipline to say, I'm going to find the caregiver that I trust. I'm going to share the information as needed with those I trust. And beyond that, no more. No more research, no more Googling, no more social media, no more talking about, and so on. So they're two very different approaches. The activist approach involves support groups and neighbors and a lot of feedback from the community. Some of that feedback from the community is going to be extremely supportive and educational and uplifting, but it has the potential that there will be pushback and negativity. That takes energy, and it's for the person to decide if they'd like to spend that energy. For the person who'd like the more inward approach, it's a different way of using one's energy. I'd like to reiterate, if a person's immune system is constantly dealing with a virus, and a virus that seems to be tricky, that seems to be hard for the immune system to work out, the approach of going inward and saying, this is where I am, and how can I feed this immunity, is an equally powerful journey as the activist. Taking care of that immune system involves nutrition that you'll hear about later in the week. The state-of-the-art, up-to-date, correct medication that you'll hear from the medical team in this week. The restful practices, the exercise, the deep sleep that the body needs to support the immune system to deal with the virus. Remember, if your immune system is dealing with the virus all the time, that means it's working a little bit harder to deal with other germs in the environment, bacteria and other viruses. An ordinary cold can be a little bit worrying for an HIV/AIDS patient. They want to be stopping, having a look at the cold, and making good decisions about how to deal with the cold, to overcome it, to not wear down the immune system that needs to be fighting the virus. So I think there are two ways of looking at it. I think they're equally valid. Both of them mean stopping and looking at this diagnosis and this illness and making a clear decision for oneself. Where's my state of health emotionally and mentally? And then making decisions on how to manage it going forward. Now, when a person is very afraid and when a person is feeling alone, perhaps in the middle of a world event, but on your own, it's very natural for the emotion of fear to flood through the body. And as we've discussed before, the emotion of fear has a contracting effect on the body. By contracting, I mean the jaw becomes tight, the chest becomes tight, the shoulders become tight, and the contraction of the body means that natural, healthy, expansive breath and expansive movement becomes very difficult. So if we go back to my comparison of the activist versus the private person, an activist has a very expansive nature. There's a moving outwards, there's a going out, there's constant evolvement, and that keeps the system moving. For the person who's going inward and working with this whole journey privately, they would need to guard against a pulling in, a withdrawing, a contracting, a becoming smaller. In that becoming smaller and contracting is the danger of getting stuck. And getting stuck can feel like at night when the body needs to be resting deeply, the mind is going round and round in circles of fear. What if, did I do, what if more, but all of these questions and fears that come up, and those do not serve us and our health whatsoever. So if a person chooses to take the route of going inward and dealing with it privately, there must be the mental decision to do what needs to be done, but no more. So when resting is happening, there's only resting, not resting and worrying. When nutrition is happening, the nutrition is being enjoyed for the purpose of the body to be healthy, not worrying and double checking and triple checking and becoming obsessive about the nutrition. Once the medical protocol has been chosen, commit to it, follow through, maybe make a date and a time where it gets reassessed, but not getting into rechecking, reassessing, redebating, re-asking all the time. So it's about conserving that mental energy with peace, the peace of mind of saying, this is the choice I've made, and this is the way I'm going to walk this journey. For the person who's using that expansive, outward, activist, engaging, talking group effort, the way they have to be careful of conserving their mental and emotional energy is by taking a break for that. It's all very well, you're serving your community and the world and fellow patients by going out there and sharing your stories and motivating. But if that's happening at the cost of your personal energy for healing, then that becomes unhealthy. So the personal mental discipline, the activist type of person would need to make is to say, these are the workshops, groups, YouTubes, discussions, meetings I'm going to attend this week, not based on what I think should happen, but based on what is suitable for where my health is right now. So if it's the middle of the winter and you're the kind of person who tends to get flu every winter, then even the activist can't be going out and about at that part of the winter. This is practical. This is about stopping every time and saying, this is where we are. This is what we've got. How can we move forward? The final step is to go back to the discussion around disclosure. It can become sort of a thorn or a pinprick for a person. And I think we as a community and we as caregivers need to always have awareness that for the patient with HIV/AIDS, there's every chance that they're healthy and well and able to live a full life. But in the back of their mind, they're going to have a worry all the time about, should I tell? And when do I tell? And how do I tell? And that's not an easy thing to do. That's not an easy thing to do. The first step is always to honor your own privacy. Secondly, as human beings, we connect and we communicate with each other. So it's natural to want to share with those we're connected to about your status. Again, I feel the time to make that decision is during a quiet, still time to consider for oneself how one would like to share this information. Maybe discuss how you would disclose it with your caregiver or another person, and rehearse a little bit how you'd share, so that there's a peace of mind of how you will share. Which questions are you prepared to answer and which you're not? How far into the personal information you'll be willing to go? Whether you're an activist or an introvert, this is on a personal level, having to disclose your status. It's not a small thing, and not all patients with chronic disease need to do that with their loved ones. So it's a step-by-step situation again of, this is where I am. This is what feels like it is healthy for me to share, given my current levels of rest and strength and activity and interaction, and make the appropriate decision from there. Just as oversharing can make a person overexposed, keeping something a secret can be a huge weight on a person. And those two weights will need to be added up and matched with the personality of the person and their current state of health. Because I still want to go back to the subject of, if one is spending emotional and mental energy on dealing with something like disclosure, it can't be at the cost of the energy needed to keep your immune system going. So we're heading into World AIDS Day. It's the 1st of December. And certainly HIV and AIDS, our understanding of it has evolved massively over the years. I think we celebrate the fact that it is now a treatable disease and can be lived with. And I invite you, if you would like to have a personal conversation on how to go forward on the activist, outward expansive approach, or the private approach, and how do you manage that, I would certainly be available to have that conversation with people either way. I'm Julia Hastie. I'm representing the Body Mind Health Connection as part of the SOPA series on managing chronic illness.